I'll tell you another story about a friend of mine named Ivor Davies, Norman Davies. Norman Davies was the leading historian on Eastern Europe. He'd married his wife, had gone to the University of Krakow. Norman Davies was acknowledged throughout the world as the leading scholar, certainly one of the first two. He's one of the few guys who can write readable books. Maybe you've read his book, Europe. It was a bestseller. You don't find history books often that are bestsellers. Ostrowski had a bestseller. When Ostrowski was going to publish about what happened to the Mossad, the Israeli government tried to stop it. And the publicity trying to stop its publication, he sold 2 million copies, made Ostrowski a rich man, but he had to hide up in Canada from hit teams from the Mossad that he thought were coming to try to kill him to silence his voice. In any event, to go back to Norman Davies, I had just gotten out of Congress. I'd returned to the practice law in Palo Alto. It was a country town when I left it. Now it's kind of the headquarters of Silicon Valley and the economy driving the nation. And I'd been invited to be a guest professor at Stanford, teach a course on political science, 20 years history, starting the Gulf of Tonkin in '64 to the budget battles of the Reagan administration. And the ADL and a campus group called Hillel said, we can't have McCloskey teaching this course. They tried, but I'd already had a contract with the university through the student board to teach this course that spring quarter. Well, they had an election for the board, and suddenly out of 9 people who had voted 8-1 to have me speak, they had a Jewish majority and 1 Israeli on the board, and they said, silence him, don't let him speak. Tried to censor. It was a big cause celeb. And finally the president of Stanford came out and said, you're denying academic freedom to Professor McCloskey, and they were criticized. Well, about this time, Ivor Davies came to see me. He had been brought to Stanford for a year to see if the students, he was teaching then at the University of London, he's at Oxford now, see if the students liked him. The undergraduates loved him. He taught 2 undergraduate courses. They said this is the finest guy. He was witty, he was funny, he could talk about the Russians, the Bulgarians, the Hungarians, the Poles. The graduate students thought he was the finest thing. Graduate students were adhering to him to try to study Eastern Europe under his thesis. It was assumed that at the end of the year he would come up for appointment to the Vucinich Chair of Eastern European History. Vucinich had retired. This chair was a highly endowed chair. If you got it, it was for life, something like $1 million endowment. And Davies was scheduled to be named. And Stanford has a process where the history department votes on whether or not to give this chair. So after the dean, I've seen the name Craig. He's one of your people that's spoken out for, I think, the revision concepts. The president and the emeritus at Stanford all thought that we were getting the best person in the world to teach at this school. Stanford only accepts from the top 1 or 2 in the nation. To be appointed as a teacher at Stanford or professor, you have to be one of the top 2 in your field at your level. And this was the absolute highest level. They consulted 25 what they call outside referees. They asked, what do you think of Davies and his books? All 25 unanimously said, of the 5 people you might consider around the world for this chair, there are 2 that are head and shoulders above the other 3, and Davies is head and shoulders above the other one. 10 days before the vote was to come in December, I think it was 1983, a history professor who was a member of the ADL contacted the ADL organization in San Francisco, and the word came back to all of the Jewish members of the faculty, have you read Davies' chapter on Poland? On the Jews in Poland. You can't write a book about Poland without the situation of the Jews in Poland, where the pogroms and the Russian czars and beyond the pale and all of the history of Jews in Poland. Davies' chapter on the Jews had dared suggest that not all Poles were anti-Semitic. And that ran counter to the view of history held by the Israelis and the Jewish community around the United States that all Jews in Poland were discriminated against by the Poles who were anti-Semitic. Well, I've talked to a lot of Poles over the years, and I've found people that didn't like Jews, and I found people that helped Jews. If you help Jews in Poland, you're going to get shot if the Nazis caught you at it. So it wasn't really easy to be pro-Jewish when you were in occupied Poland, whether the Russians or the Germans. In any event, Davy's chapter was deemed by the ADL to be hostile to Israel because of the simple suggestion that not all Poles were anti-Semitic. Well, we took them on in a lawsuit later. We lost the case on appeal, but we had a famous psychiatrist examine Davis's comments. In 52 occasions, he had spoken of Jews, and in 52 occasions, he'd spoken of Poles. And the psychologist used words like, if you talked like a greedy Jew, that was anti-Semitic. A thoughtful Jew, that was pro-Israel or pro-Jewish. If you had a vicious Pole or a kind Pole, of those 52 references, in each case, they came down 26 to 26. You would infer 26 favorable to the Poles and 26 critical, 26 favorable to the Jews, 26 critical. But to the ADL, that wasn't enough. Now, the history professors, not all of them come to every vote. And of the 38 professors, they circulated amongst the 13 Jewish professors, be there for the vote. The vote was held, the vote was 13 to 12 to deny that chair to Ivor Davies. So he does not have a platform in this state. The Jews were happy, the ADL was happy. They had prevented a forum from a voice that spoke out for reason and spoke out for a different view of history. If you've read, there was a Jewish, I think she's died now, Lucy Davidovich. Anybody heard that name? She wrote out of New York that, in effect, Norman Davies was a revisionist, that his view of the history of Europe was detrimental to the Jewish community around the world. Well, what happened to the ADL? They got caught in a funny deal. Bullock, spying on every American from my wife, if Mills College held a seminar in the Mideast, he was there to make sure that nobody was speaking against Israel, and if they did speak in favor of the Palestinians or against Israel, the name went on his list, the license plate, the thing get funneled around so that a dossier is in his name or her name all over the ADL offices in the United States, available only to the ADL. But if you remember back in the late 1980s, Israel had an ally, a fellow pariah in the international community named South Africa. And South Africa was not adhering to the United Nations resolution on Namibia, which they were supposed to give up. And Israel was not adhering to resolutions of the United Nations 242 and 338, which spoke, if there were going to be an Israeli state, there would be an equality with the Palestinian state. That's the way you infer them. Israel didn't want to give up the occupied territories. It was in violation. There's pretty good evidence that the Israeli nuclear weapons were tested by the South Africans. The diamonds that you can pick up the television tonight and read about the jewelry exchange, where do those diamonds come from? South Africa to Antwerp to here, where you can bet that much of the jewelry and diamond industry is based on South African diamonds. Well, Bullock and the ADL started looking at groups that were against apartheid in South Africa. Well, there were a lot of nice American ladies that thought that it was time to end apartheid in South Africa, and so there were women all over the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles that thought apartheid is a bad thing. Well, Bullock starts going to their meetings. And so suddenly you have the ADL not only developing intelligence on people hostile to Israel, but people that are hostile to the Boer, the Smuts, Botha governments in South Africa. And what happened next was the South African intelligence people came out to see Mr. Bullock of the ADL, and they came out to see Officer Gerard, and they had lunch, and they said, you know, we'd pay you money if you can get us information about the people in the United States that are against apartheid in South Africa. So Bullock and Gerard collected, I think, $16,000, sent 27 reports to the South African Intelligence Agency about Americans taking a political position under a free peace position, whether you agree with them or not. But because they're against South Africa, they must be against Israel. And if you're against the Jewish state, you're against Jews, and that's the definition, Mr. Perlmutter and some of those fellows, that's the new anti-Semitism. Well, about that time, the U.S. FBI got the word that South Africans were trying to pirate technology from Silicon Valley. So the FBI came out, and sooner or later they caught Bullock collecting information, and they put him under surveillance, and then they called him in and interrogated him, and Bullock says, yeah, absolutely, I'm helping the ADL. Of course, we've been looking at the anti-apartheid people. And so what happened was the FBI then went to the San Francisco police, who are kind of, they're like cops in a lot of places. They're not bright. They're Irish or Italian. And the Irish cops didn't know that the Jews were so powerful in San Francisco and funded nearly every Democratic candidate from the governorship down to the Congress. And when the San Francisco police learned that their officer Gerard was illegally obtaining information from the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Post Office and other people, and funneling it to the not only to the Israeli consulate or the Jewish organizations, but selling it to the South African intelligence. You know what the dumb Irish cops did? They went and got search warrants to go into the ADL offices in San Francisco and L.A., and, man, they showed up and they ran into a funny thing. The L.A. police thought it was a little strange. And it turned out that the Israelis for some years, or the ADL, has been funding 10 or 12 police officers a year. They buy them 2 weeks in Israel. Take them over there, buy them drinks and all other things that go with a 2-week stag visit to a foreign country, because they want to ingratiate themselves with police departments to give them information about people hostile to Israel, in return for which they'll tell the police when somebody desecrates a synagogue who it is. And that connection between the Israelis and the ADL, the Mossad, the ADL, and the police, even up to the level of the FBI, they'd start inviting the head of the FBI to dinners, and he'd tell us district directors cooperate with the ADL. They're really a fine group against bigotry and anti-Semitism. So you build up an agency and an organization with the capacity to destroy the careers of people, whether they were in politics or somebody like Audrey Shabazz running an education for school teachers, or an Ivor Davies, who was a history professor and was denied the most prestigious chair in Eastern European history because of their efforts. And that kind of situation, that kind of power, in this country, luckily, the pendulum swings back and forth. And when the pendulum swings one way to excess, as I believe it has in favor of the Jewish community, the Israeli lobby, sooner or later it'll swing back. And the important thing is never to accept what somebody says is the history, whether it was 10 years ago or 30 years ago or 50 years ago. Because the people that first try to write that history are people who want to give a message that is consistent with what their political views are. And if you've suffered 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, you can justify practically anything to preserve a Jewish state. Right or wrong, no matter what atrocities they may commit. The kidnapping of that guy, what was his name, Vanunu, their own nuclear guy, they put a football helmet on so he can't talk. I mean, this is not a free society. I'll close with one humorous incident you'll enjoy. I was outraged when the Israelis invaded Lebanon in the 1954.